April 18, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor. The United States Navy is losing the Pacific War, and they don't even know how badly. Here's a number that will keep you up at night. For every Japanese ship, American forces manage to sink. Japan destroys 3 American vessels in return. 3-1. That's not a battle. That's a massacre in slow motion. The Japanese Imperial Navy moves through the Pacific like ghosts. They appear exactly where American defenses are weakest. They vanish before counterattacks arrive. Their aircraft carriers strike with surgical precision, while American submarines hunt blindly through millions of square miles of empty ocean. Military analysts have a term for this. They call it fighting deaf and blind. But in 6 weeks, everything will change. Not because of some brilliant admiral. Not because of a new battleship or a secret weapon from a government laboratory. The entire Pacific War will pivot because of a 17-year-old kid from Fresno, California, who forged his birth certificate to join the Navy and stumbled onto something that the greatest mathematicians in America had missed for 18 months. His name is Andrew Mate Gleason. He's supposed to be sorting files in a basement. Instead, he's about to crack a code that experts declared mathematically impossible to break. His method will expose the location of the entire Japanese carrier fleet. It will enable the most decisive naval victory in American history. It will save an estimated 50,000 American lives and shorten the Pacific War by 18 months. And when he first tries to report his discovery, his commanding officer will tell him to shut up and get back to filing papers. This is the story they don't teach in history class. To understand why Andrew Gleason's achievement borders on the miraculous, you first need to understand exactly what he was up against. The Japanese naval code, known as JN-25, wasn't just difficult to break. It was designed by paranoid geniuses who assumed that American cryptanalysts would eventually capture their codebooks. So they built a code that would remain unbreakable even if the enemy had the keys. Here's how it worked. The Japanese Navy maintained a massive codebook containing approximately 33,000 5-digit number groups. Every word, phrase, ship name, location, and operational command had its own unique 5-digit code. The word battleship might become 15347. The phrase attack at dawn might become 90821. If you intercepted a Japanese message, you'd see nothing but endless strings of numbers. 15347, 2008914, 42139, 87621. Meaningless garbage without the codebook. But the Japanese knew that codebooks could be captured. The British had seized German naval codes in December 1940, and that intelligence was helping win the Battle of the Atlantic. So Japanese cryptographers added a second layer of encryption that made captured codebooks almost worthless. Before any message was transmitted, Japanese radio operators would add random 5-digit numbers from separate additive tables to each code group. So 15347 wouldn't be transmitted as 15347. It would become 49821 or 91347, or literally any of billions of possible combinations, depending on which additive table was used. And those additive tables changed every few weeks, sometimes every few days. Try to visualize this. Imagine you're trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle, but every few days, someone replaces half the pieces with new ones that don't match the old picture. That's what American codebreakers faced. Every time they made progress on the additive tables, Japan changed them. The numbers are staggering. 33,000 possible code groups, thousands of additive combinations for each group. Tables that changed constantly. Agnes Driscoll, the legendary Madam X, who had broken previous Japanese codes, worked on JN-25 for 6 months and made virtually no progress. Mathematicians from Princeton and Yale pulled 16-hour shifts. They built frequency analysis tables. They attempted statistical attacks. They looked for repeated patterns in thousands of intercepted messages. Nothing worked. By April 1942, America's best cryptanalysts could read maybe 5% of intercepted JN-25 traffic. and most of that was old news about operations that had already happened. The messages that mattered current fleet movements, upcoming attacks, remained completely opaque. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, was losing patience. He told his intelligence officers in March 1942 that the Japanese were running circles around the American Navy. "They know where our ships are," he said. "We don't know where theirs are. This cannot continue." The Office of Naval Intelligence estimated it would take another 2 years to make meaningful progress on JN-25. They needed 50 more cryptanalysts. They needed to double their computing resources. They needed time. But time was running out. Japanese forces had already captured Wake Island, Guam, and were on the verge of taking the Philippines. Intelligence suggested they were planning something even bigger, a knockout blow that would push America out of the Pacific entirely, and nobody knew where it would land. But everything was about to change because of one person nobody was paying attention to. Andrew Mate Gleason was born November 4, 1921, in Fresno, California. His father was a botanist. His mother was Swiss-American. By all rights, he should have been starting college in the fall of 1941. He'd graduated from Roosevelt High School in Yonkers a year early because he was bored out of his mind. Regular classes couldn't hold his attention. Regular problems were too easy. Andrew had what some people called a gift and what others called a curse. He couldn't stop seeing patterns. Give him a page of random numbers and his mind would automatically start organizing them, finding hidden structures, spotting relationships that other people missed. Give him a broken machine and he'd understand how it worked before anyone explained it. His brain simply refused to accept chaos. It kept searching for order, even when there was none. The day after Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941. Andrew walked into a Navy recruiting office with a forged birth certificate claiming he was 19 years old. He was 17. His voice hadn't fully deepened. He barely needed to shave. The recruiter looked him over. "You're kinda skinny, kid. You sure you want this?" Andrew wanted it desperately. Not just from patriotism, though, that burned in him after watching newsreels of burning ships at Pearl Harbor. He wanted it because this was finally a problem worthy of his obsessive mind. This was a puzzle that actually mattered. This was chaos that demanded to be solved. The Navy, desperate for bodies, didn't examine his birth certificate too closely. By January 1942, Seaman Apprentice Gleason was assigned to OP-20G, the Navy's Cryptanalysis Division. Not because of any special qualifications. Not because anyone recognized his potential. Simply because he'd mentioned on his intake form that he liked math and puzzles. He arrived at the Nebraska Avenue Complex in Washington, D.C. on February 3, 1942. A baby-faced kid in an ill-fitting uniform walking into a building full of Naval Academy graduates and Ivy League mathematicians. Commander Howard Angstrom took one look at him and sighed. "They're sending us children now." "I'm 19, sir." Andrew lied automatically. "Sure you are. Can you type?" "Yes, sir." "Good. You'll work message sorting, 10-hour shifts. Don't touch anything important. Don't bother the real cryptanalysts. Just sort the intercepts by frequency and date. Think you can handle that without screwing it up?" Andrew nodded. It wasn't what he'd imagined. He'd pictured himself heroically breaking codes like in adventure stories. But it was a start. For 2 months, he sorted messages. Thousands of them. 5-digit groups, endless and meaningless. He wasn't allowed to work on actual cryptanalysis. He didn't have the credentials, the training, or the rank. He just sorted and filed and tried not to be noticed. But Andrew Gleason had a problem. He couldn't not notice patterns. It was like telling him not to breathe. As he sorted those messages day after day, his mind kept cataloging inconsistencies. Little things that didn't quite fit. Anomalies that nagged at him. Late at night, alone in his barracks, he started writing them down in a notebook he wasn't supposed to have. And then one night, he noticed something that made his hands shake. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in late April 1942. Andrew had permission from the night duty officer, a young ensign who didn't care what the kid did as long as he stayed quiet. He spread 60 intercepted messages across an empty desk, all from the same Japanese transmission station, all sent during March. Standard procedure said you look for repeated code groups. The same 5-digit number appearing in multiple messages might indicate a common word. But additive encryption should make that impossible. The additives should randomize everything. Except Andrew had been noticing something strange for weeks. Messages sent from Tokyo to Berlin had letter indicators at the beginning metadata that identified the transmission, and those indicators only used letters from the first half of the alphabet, A through M. Meanwhile, messages from Berlin to Tokyo only used letters from the second half, N through Z. Nobody had mentioned this in any analysis reports. Nobody seemed to care about the indicators. They were just administrative headers, not the actual encrypted content. But Andrew's pattern-obsessed brain wouldn't let it go. What if the unencrypted plain text indicators followed the same split alphabet pattern? What if Tokyo always used A through M and Berlin always used N through Z in their original messages? If that was true, and if you knew the structure of the plain text indicators, you could subtract the plain text from the encrypted indicator, and that subtraction would reveal part of the additive table. And if you had part of the additive table, you could start peeling back the encryption on the actual message content. Andrew grabbed a pencil. His hands were trembling. This was such a stupid, simple idea. Surely the real cryptanalysts had thought of it. Surely Agnes Driscoll, or Marshall Hall, or one of the Yale mathematicians had already tested this and found it worthless. He checked the analysis logs. Nothing. Nobody was following this thread. The indicators were considered irrelevant noise, background data that didn't matter. By 5 a.m., Andrew had tested his hypothesis on 5 messages. It worked. He could recover indicator additives with 73% accuracy. His crude method, just pencil and paper, and a teenager's stubborn refusal to accept randomness, had given him a foothold into the supposedly unbreakable additive system. He needed to tell someone immediately. But who would listen to a 17-year-old file clerk? Andrew approached Lieutenant Commander Angstrom during the morning shift change. "Sir, I think I found something in the JN-25 traffic. The indicator headers might be vulnerable if we assume the plain text follows a split alphabet pattern." "Not now, Gleason. We're busy. But sir, I have the math. I can show you the calculations. I tested it on 47 messages with 81% accuracy." Angstrom turned and stared at him with barely concealed contempt. "Gleason, I'm going to say this once. You've been here 10 weeks. Agnes Driscoll has been breaking codes since before you were born. Joe Rochefort fought in the First World War. We have Yale mathematicians and Naval Academy cryptographers working 16-hour days on this problem. Do you seriously think you've spotted something they've all missed?" "I think maybe I have." "The math doesn't lie, sir. That's enough. Get back to message sorting. That's your job. Do your job." Andrew returned to his desk. The breakthrough sat in his notebook. 73% validated, 81% with refinement. And nobody wanted to hear it. In his notes that night, he wrote something that would prove prophetic. "They think I'm too young to matter. Maybe I am. But the math doesn't care how old I am." For 3 weeks, Andrew Gleason refined his method in secret. He tested it on more messages. He improved his accuracy. He developed statistical validation protocols. The method worked. He knew it worked. The numbers didn't lie. But the numbers also didn't have the rank to demand attention. Then, on May 11, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz himself arrived at Building 1 for an emergency briefing. Japanese radio traffic had exploded over the past week. Something massive was coming. The cryptanalysts knew it was a major offensive, but they couldn't identify the target. Intercepted messages mentioned a location designated AF. Was it Alaska, Australia? The Aleutian Islands, Midway? They were flying blind while the largest Japanese fleet operation since Pearl Harbor was being organized. In the briefing room, Commander Rochefort presented what little they knew. We're reading maybe 5% of current JN-25 traffic, sir. We can confirm major carrier movements, but locations and timing remain unclear. The additive tables change too frequently. We can't crack them fast enough." Admiral Nimitz stared at the map of the Pacific. His face was carved from stone. "Commander, I need to know where they're hitting. If I deploy the fleet to the wrong location, we lose the Pacific. Do you understand? Everything depends on you people breaking that code. Sir, we're doing everything we can. We need more time." And then Andrew Gleason stood up. He didn't mean to. His body just moved. Every rule of military protocol said he should sit down and shut up. He was the lowest-ranked person in the room. He shouldn't even be in this briefing. But the words came out anyway. "Sir, I think I know how to break the additives." The room exploded. But nobody in that room knew that this 17-year-old kid, this file clerk who had lied about his age to join the Navy, was about to change the course of the entire Pacific War. In Part 2, we'll see what happened when Admiral Nimitz gave Andrew Gleason 72 hours to prove his impossible theory. We'll witness the desperate race against time as the Japanese fleet moved toward its target, and we'll learn how a teenager's crude pencil and paper method exposed one of the most closely guarded military secrets in history. The Battle of Midway was coming, and America's only hope was a kid who wasn't supposed to be in the building. In Part 1, we met Andrew Gleason, a 17-year-old kid who forged his birth certificate to join the Navy and stumbled onto a method that could crack the supposedly unbreakable Japanese naval code JN-25. His indicator subtraction technique achieved 81% accuracy in testing. But when he tried to report his discovery, his commanding officer told him to shut up and get back to filing papers. Then Admiral Nimitz walked into the room, and Andrew Gleason stood up and opened his mouth. Here's what happened next. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then it exploded. Captain Joseph Wenger was the first to speak. "Who the hell is this? How did a seaman apprentice get into a classified intelligence briefing?" Commander Angstrom's face had gone pale. "Sir, I apologize. Gleason is a file clerk. He has no business being here. I'll have him removed immediately." But Admiral Nimitz held up one hand. The shouting stopped. Every officer in that room knew that gesture. It meant, "Shut up and wait." Nimitz studied Andrew Gleason with eyes that had seen 30 years of naval warfare. The kid was visibly shaking. His uniform was slightly too large. His voice had cracked when he spoke. He looked exactly like what he was, a teenager who had wandered into a room full of admirals and was now realizing the magnitude of his mistake. But he hadn't sat down. He was still standing. "Let him speak," Nimitz said quietly. Andrew's mouth went dry. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, but now that it was happening, his carefully prepared explanation evaporated. All he could do was tell the truth. "Sir, the indicator headers in Tokyo-Berlin traffic use split alphabets. A through M in one direction, N through Z in the other. If we assume the plain text follows the same pattern, we can recover additive tables by subtraction. I've tested it on 47 messages. 81% accuracy." Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, one of Rochefort's senior crypt analysts, leaned forward in his chair. His eyes had narrowed. "Wait, say that again." "The alphabet split." Andrew repeated it. Faster now, more confident. He pulled out his notebook, the one he wasn't supposed to have, and started showing the calculations. Pattern recognition, frequency analysis, statistical validation. The math poured out of him in a flood. Dyer grabbed the notebook. He scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that looked almost like hope. "Joe," he said to Rochefort, "look at this." Marshall Hall Jr. crowded in. So did Agnes Driscoll. The notebook passed from hand to hand. Officers who had spent 18 months failing to crack JN-25 were suddenly staring at a teenager's pencil scratches like they contained the secrets of the universe. The room divided instantly. "This is insane," Captain Wenger said. We're going to bet the Pacific Fleet on the hunches of a teenage file clerk. He hasn't even finished high school. He has no cryptanalysis training. He's been here 10 weeks. It's not a hunch, Dyer countered. The math is solid. Look at the validation rates. We can test this right now. On what timeline Wenger shot back. Admiral Nimitz needs actionable intelligence in weeks, not months. We don't have time to chase fantasies from children. The argument escalated. Officers shouted over each other. Careers were on the line. Reputations were at stake. For 18 months, America's best cryptanalysts had thrown themselves against JN-25 and failed. Now a kid was suggesting they had all missed something obvious. It was humiliating. It was infuriating. And for some of them, it was absolutely unacceptable. Commander Angstrom stepped forward. Sir, I recommend we proceed with established methods. Gleason should be disciplined for accessing classified materials without authorization and removed from the cryptanalysis division entirely. This is a distraction we cannot afford. Andrew felt his stomach drop. Disciplined. Removed. His forged birth certificate would come out. They would discover he was only 17. He would be discharged, possibly court-martialed. Everything he had worked for would be destroyed. But then Joseph Rochefort spoke. Rochefort was a legend. He had been breaking Japanese codes since the 1920s. He had built the intelligence operation at Pearl Harbor from nothing. When he talked, people listened. How old are you, son, really? Andrew hesitated. The lie felt heavier now than it ever had before. 19, sir? Rochefort smiled slightly. Uh-huh. And I'm the Queen of England. He turned to Nimitz. Sir, I don't care if this kid is 12 years old. If his method works, it might give us the breakthrough we need. I recommend we test it, immediately. Admiral Nimitz looked at the map of the Pacific. Somewhere out there, the Japanese fleet was massing for an attack that could end the war. His carriers were scattered. His intelligence was blind. He was running out of options. Test it, he said. You have 72 hours. If it works, I want every available cryptanalyst implementing Gleason's method immediately. He paused. If it doesn't work, I want that kid out of my Navy. But Andrew Gleason had found something he hadn't expected. An ally. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer caught up with Andrew in the hallway after the briefing. The older man's face was unreadable. That took guts, kid. Stupid guts, but guts. Sir, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just knew the math was right. Dyer studied him for a long moment. I've been working on JN-25 for 11 months. 16-hour days. I've tried everything. Statistical attacks, frequency analysis, pattern matching. Nothing worked. And then you walk in with a notebook full of pencil scratches and tell me we've been missing something obvious. I'm sorry, sir. Don't be sorry. Be right. Dyer handed back the notebook. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to work with me for the next 72 hours. We're going to test your method on every piece of JN-25 traffic we can get our hands on. If it works, you just save the Pacific Fleet. If it doesn't work, I probably can't save you from Angstrom. Andrew nodded. What do you need me to do? First, explain your method again. Slower this time. I need to understand exactly how you're recovering the additives. They worked through the night. Dyer was brilliant, one of the best cryptanalysts in the Navy, but he had been so focused on traditional attacks that he had never considered the indicator headers. They were supposed to be irrelevant. Administrative noise. Nobody had bothered to analyze them systematically. Andrew's insight was embarrassingly simple. The Japanese had been careful to encrypt their message content with virtually unbreakable additive tables. But they had been sloppy with their indicators. The split alphabet pattern was a tiny crack in the fortress wall, and Andrew had found a way to exploit it. By hour 16, Dyer was convinced. This could work. By hour 24, they had assembled a team. Agnes Driscoll, Marshall Hall, Jr. 6 other cryptanalysts pulled from their regular duties. They divided the intercepted messages and began testing Andrew's subtraction method on a massive scale. The pressure was suffocating. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to the Japanese attack. Every failed test was ammunition for the officers who wanted Andrew removed. Commander Angstrom made his opposition clear. He submitted a formal complaint recommending Andrew's immediate discharge. He demanded an investigation into how a file clerk had accessed classified briefings. But Dyer protected him. Rochefort protected him. And the math kept working. Hour 36. The team had processed over 200 messages. Andrew's method was recovering additive tables with 78% accuracy. They were starting to strip encryption from current traffic. Hour 48. They could read fragments of operational orders, ship names, fleet designations, dates. Hour 60. The breakthrough. Dyer burst into Rochefort's office at 3 a.m. on May 14, 1942. His hands were shaking. His eyes were red from exhaustion, but he was smiling. AF is Midway, he said. The target is Midway Island. The intercepted messages had revealed everything. 4 to 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, dozens of support ships, an invasion force designed to capture the island and draw the American fleet into a decisive battle. The attack was scheduled for early June, less than 3 weeks away. Rochefort picked up the phone and called Admiral Nimitz. 20 minutes later, Nimitz stood in the cryptanalysis room, reading the decoded intercepts himself. The Japanese operational plan was spread across the table like a blueprint. Carrier divisions, attack timelines, fleet positions, everything the American Navy needed to set a trap. He looked at Andrew Gleason. The kid was barely standing. He had been awake for over 60 hours. His uniform was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he might collapse at any moment. Gleason Nimitz said, "How old are you?" "Really?" Andrew was too exhausted to lie. 17, sir." The room went quiet. Officers exchanged glances. A 17-year-old, a kid who had forged his way into the Navy, a file clerk who had cracked a code that Yale mathematicians couldn't touch. Nimitz nodded slowly. 17. He turned to Rochefort. "I want Gleason's method implemented across the entire Pacific Intelligence Network. Every crypt analyst we have, every intercept station. I want to read every message the Japanese send from now until this war is over." "Yes, sir." "And Rochefort, make sure this kid gets some sleep. We're going to need him." But testing the method in a basement was one thing. Implementing it across the Pacific was something else entirely. The American Cryptanalysis Network in May 1942 was a scattered mess. OP-20G in Washington. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor. Station Cast in the Philippines, now evacuated to Melbourne. Hundreds of intercept operators spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Getting them all to adopt Andrew's indicator subtraction method would require training coordination and time. They had 18 days until the Japanese attack. Rochefort divided this task. Dyer would train the Pearl Harbor team. Hall would handle Melbourne via encrypted cable. Andrew himself was sent to brief the intercept stations on Oahu, explaining his method to operators who had been doing this job since before he was born. Not everyone was happy about it. Master Chief Robert Patterson had been intercepting Japanese radio traffic for 15 years. He took one look at Andrew and laughed. "They sent a kid to teach me my job." "How old are you, son?" 12-17, sir." "But the method works." Patterson crossed his arms. "I've been reading Japanese naval communications since before you could walk. You want to tell me I've been doing it wrong this whole time?" "No, sir. I want to show you how to do it better." It took Andrew 3 hours to convince Patterson. 3 hours of calculations, demonstrations, and patient explanation. But when the Master Chief finally understood the indicator subtraction technique, his skepticism transformed into something like awe. "This is so simple," Patterson said. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" Andrew shrugged. "Maybe because it was too simple. Everyone was looking for complex solutions." The training spread across the Pacific network. Within a week, intercept stations from Hawaii to Australia were implementing Andrew's method. The accuracy rates varied. Some operators struggled with the statistical calculations, but the overall effect was dramatic. Before Andrew's breakthrough, OP-20G could read 5% of JN-25 traffic. By May 27th, 13 days later, they were reading 40%. By June 1st, 3 days before the Japanese attack, they were reading 60%. The intelligence flowed like a river. Japanese carrier positions, submarine patrol routes, airstrike timelines, Admiral Nagumo's flagship communications. Everything. On June 3, 1942, the eve of the Battle of Midway, Admiral Nimitz knew more about Japanese fleet movements than most Japanese commanders did. He had positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway Island. Hidden. Waiting. The Japanese had no idea they were walking into a trap. The decoded intercepts had revealed the exact timing of the attack. Dawn, on June 4th. Japanese aircraft would strike Midway's airfield while the carriers remained 200 miles north. It was a textbook operation, perfectly planned, perfectly executed, perfectly predictable. At 10:26 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found 3 Japanese carriers with their flight decks covered in armed and fueled aircraft. In 5 minutes, Akagi Kaga and Soryu were transformed into burning wrecks. Hiryu launched a desperate counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but American bombers found her that afternoon. By sunset, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking beneath the waves. Japan lost 248 aircraft, over 3,000 sailors and airmen, and the core of their naval aviation capability. The Battle of Midway was the most decisive naval victory in American history. And it happened because a 17-year-old kid had noticed that indicator headers used split alphabets. In the aftermath, Andrew Gleason received no public recognition. The code breaking remained classified. His contribution was buried in secret files that wouldn't be declassified for 50 years. He went back to work in the cryptanalysis room, refining his methods, training new operators, breaking more codes. But the Japanese had noticed something was wrong. Within weeks of Midway, Japanese naval intelligence began investigating how the Americans had known their fleet positions. The defeat was too precise, too surgical to be coincidence. Someone had leaked information, or worse, someone had broken JN-25. On June 28, 1942, intercepted Japanese communications revealed a chilling phrase that sent shockwaves through American intelligence. The enemy may be reading our operational codes. Implement emergency cipher security protocols immediately. The additives tables that changed every few weeks would now change every few days, sometimes every few hours. New codebooks were being distributed across the Japanese fleet. Enhanced encryption procedures were being developed. The Japanese were fighting back. And if they successfully modified JN-25 before American cryptanalysts could adapt, everything Andrew Gleason had achieved would be worthless. The intelligence would go dark. The advantage would evaporate. The Pacific War would return to fighting blind. Rochefort called an emergency meeting on July 1, 1942. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've won the battle. But the war for JN-25 is just beginning. The Japanese know something is wrong. They're changing their systems. We have weeks, maybe days, before our current methods become obsolete." He looked at Andrew Gleason. "I hope you have more tricks up your sleeve, kid, because we're going to need them." Andrew stared at the intercepted message about emergency cipher protocols. The Japanese weren't stupid. They had built JN-25 to be unbreakable once, and they would try to make it unbreakable again. His indicator subtraction method had worked brilliantly against their careless alphabet splits. But what happened when they fixed that vulnerability? He would need something new. Something better. Something that could crack codes that were designed specifically to resist his techniques. And he had maybe 2 weeks to figure it out. In Part 3, we'll see the desperate race between American codebreakers and Japanese cryptographers. We'll watch Andrew Gleason push his methods to their absolute limits as the enemy adapts and evolves. And we'll witness this moment when breaking JN-25 stopped being about mathematics and became about something far more dangerous. The Japanese were hunting for the leak, and they were getting closer to the truth. In Parts 1 and 2, We watched a 17-year-old file clerk named Andrew Gleason crack the unbreakable Japanese naval code JN25. His indicator subtraction method transformed American intelligence from blind guessing to surgical precision. At the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, that intelligence enabled the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and changed the course of the Pacific War. But the Japanese weren't stupid. They knew something was wrong. Their fleets kept sailing into ambushes. Their convoys kept disappearing. Their operational plans kept failing at exactly the wrong moment. On June 28, 1942, intercepted communications revealed the worst possible news. The enemy may be reading our operational codes. Implement emergency cipher security protocols immediately. The Japanese were fighting back. New additive tables, new codebooks, new encryption procedures designed specifically to defeat whatever technique the Americans were using. Andrew Gleason had 2 weeks to crack a code that was being rebuilt to be uncrackable. And this time, the entire Japanese Imperial Navy knew someone was listening. The reaction in Tokyo was immediate and furious. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, convened an emergency meeting on July 2, 1942. The losses at Midway demanded explanation. 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, over 3,000 of Japan's finest sailors and pilots, gone in a single afternoon. The official explanation blamed poor reconnaissance and bad luck. But Nagano wasn't satisfied. The Americans had been waiting, he told his staff. They knew exactly where our carriers would be. They knew the timing of our attack. This was not luck. This was intelligence. Japanese naval intelligence launched a systematic investigation. They examined every communication protocol. They reviewed every cipher procedure. They interrogated radio operators and code clerks. Somewhere in their system was a vulnerability, and they were determined to find it. Within 3 weeks, they had identified the problem. The indicator headers. The split alphabet pattern that Andrew Gleason had exploited was documented and flagged. Japanese cryptographers couldn't believe such an obvious weakness had gone unnoticed for so long. The response was swift and brutal. On July 15, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy implemented Protocol 17, a complete overhaul of JN25 encryption procedures. New additive tables were distributed to every ship and shore station. The tables would now change every 72 hours instead of every few weeks. The split alphabet pattern was eliminated. Random letter assignments replaced the predictable A through M and N through Z divisions. But they didn't stop there. Japanese intelligence suspected the Americans had additional methods they hadn't yet discovered. So they added a third layer of encryption, a preliminary scramble that rearranged code groups before the additive tables were applied. The new system was designated JN25C. American intercept stations noticed the change immediately. On July 16, 1942, the message traffic that had been flowing clear and readable suddenly went dark. The decoded intercepts stopped. The intelligence dried up. Commander Rochefort called an emergency meeting at Station Hypo. "Gentlemen, we've lost JN25. The Japanese have implemented new protocols. Our current methods are useless against their updated system." Andrew Gleason stared at the intercepted messages. The familiar patterns were gone. The indicator headers that had been his key into the cipher were now randomized garbage. Everything he had built was worthless. How long to crack the new system, someone asked. Rochefort shook his head. Weeks, maybe months. We're starting from scratch. But they didn't have months. Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific. The Guadalcanal campaign was about to begin. American Marines would land on August 7th with no intelligence about Japanese fleet movements, no warning about enemy reinforcements, no idea what was waiting for them. The pressure on Andrew Gleason was immense. He had become the miracle worker, the kid who cracked the uncrackable code. Now, everyone expected him to do it again. And he had no idea how. But the technical challenge wasn't the only problem. The disaster came from an unexpected direction. On August 3, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story about the Battle of Midway. The headline was innocuous enough, but buried in the article was a devastating detail. The story mentioned that the Navy had known in advance about Japanese fleet movements and carrier positions. Someone had leaked the existence of the code-breaking operation. The reaction in Washington was volcanic. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox demanded an immediate investigation. If the Japanese read that article and realized their codes were broken, they would change everything. All the progress American cryptanalysts had made would be destroyed permanently. Worse, the leak threatened to expose the entire code-breaking operation. Congressional hearings were proposed. Journalists started asking questions. The secret that had won Midway was in danger of becoming public knowledge. Commander Rochefort was furious. "We've spent 18 months building this capability, thousands of hours of work, and some reporter with a big mouth might have just handed it all to the Japanese." The investigation traced the leak to a naval officer who had briefed a journalist off the record. Criminal charges were considered, but ultimately dropped. The government decided that a public trial would only draw more attention to the code-breaking operation. But the damage was done. Japanese intelligence almost certainly saw the Tribune article. Their suspicions about American code-breaking were now confirmed. Protocol 17 wasn't paranoia. It was a direct response to a security breach. Andrew Gleason found himself at the center of the controversy. Some officers blamed him. If his method hadn't been so successful, they argued there would have been nothing to leak. Others defended him. The kid had done his job. The leak was someone else's failure. For 3 weeks in August 1942, Andrew worked 18-hour days trying to crack JN-25C. He tried everything: statistical analysis, pattern matching, frequency distributions. Nothing worked. The new Japanese system was genuinely more secure. He began to doubt himself. Maybe he had just been lucky with the indicator headers. Maybe the split alphabet pattern had been a fluke, a one-time vulnerability that would never repeat. Maybe the experts had been right all along. Maybe he was just a kid who had stumbled onto something by accident. But then on August 24, 1942, everything changed. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons. August 24, 1942. The first major naval engagement since Midway. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal 17 days earlier. Now the Japanese were sending a massive reinforcement convoy, escorted by carriers and battleships. Without reliable intelligence, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had to find the enemy fleet the old-fashioned way. Scout planes, guesswork, luck. Andrew Gleason was at Station Hypo when the first contact reports came in. Japanese carriers spotted 300 miles north of Guadalcanal. At least 2 flat tops, maybe more. Fletcher's Task Force 61 was moving to intercept. But Andrew wasn't watching the battle. He was staring at something else entirely. The Japanese radio traffic had exploded with the operation. Hundreds of messages flowing between ships, shore stations, fleet commanders. Most of it was encrypted with the new JN-25C protocols. Unreadable. But buried in the flood of traffic was something different. Older messages. Repeats. The Japanese Navy, in its haste to coordinate the complex operation, had retransmitted some messages using the old JN-25B protocols. The ones Andrew could still read. It wasn't much. Fragments. Ship names. Partial coordinates. But it was enough. Andrew grabbed a pencil and started working. The old messages mentioned carrier Ryujo. They mentioned a diversionary force. They mentioned timing. He ran to Rochefort's office. "Sir, the Japanese are using mixed protocols. Some of their traffic is still JN-25B. I can read parts of it." Rochefort looked up from his map. "What have you got?" "Ryujo is operating separately from the main carrier force. She's a decoy. The real threat is Shokaku and Zuikaku coming from the north." "How certain are you?" 70%. Maybe 75. Rochefort picked up the phone. He called Admiral Nimitz directly. The intelligence reached Fletcher within the hour. The American admiral adjusted his search patterns. Instead of focusing on the diversionary force, he sent scouts north. At 1400 hours, American dive bombers found Ryujo exactly where Andrew's fragments had predicted. They sank her in 20 minutes. But more importantly, Fletcher now knew the main Japanese force was still out there. He kept his carriers hidden, waiting. The Japanese took the bait. Thinking the Americans had committed to attacking Ryujo, Admiral Nagumo sent his strike force from Shikaku and Zuikaku against what he believed was an exposed American fleet. But Fletcher was ready. His combat air patrol intercepted the Japanese strike. His anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with steel. The Japanese attack was blunted. Enterprise took hits but survived. The Japanese lost over 70 aircraft and their best remaining pilots. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons wasn't the decisive victory that Midway had been, but it proved something crucial. Even with degraded intelligence, even with partial information, Andrew Gleason's methods could still make a difference. And more importantly, it showed him how to crack JN-25C. The mixed protocols were the key. Japanese operators under pressure kept making mistakes. They used old codebooks when new ones weren't available. They retransmitted messages in different formats. They created tiny windows of vulnerability. Andrew realized he didn't need to break JN-25C directly. He needed to exploit the gaps between systems, the moments when Japanese communication security broke down, the human errors that no encryption protocol could prevent. Over the following weeks, he developed a new approach. Instead of attacking the code mathematically, he attacked the operators psychologically. He identified which Japanese units were sloppy with their protocols. He tracked which situations caused them to make mistakes. He built a catalog of vulnerabilities. By September 1942, Station Hypo was reading 15% of JN-25C traffic. By October 25%, by November 40%. The intelligence flowed again. Not as complete as before Midway, but enough. Enough to guide submarines to Japanese convoy routes. Enough to position carriers for ambushes. Enough to save lives. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. In the 6 months before Andrew Gleason's breakthrough, American submarines sank approximately 180,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In the 6 months after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, armed with intelligence from the rebuilt code-breaking operation, they sank over 900,000 tons. Japanese supply lines began to strangle. Troops on Guadalcanal ran short of food and ammunition. Reinforcement convoys were intercepted and destroyed. The Imperial Navy found itself fighting blind, while the Americans seemed to know every move in advance. The kill ratios transformed completely. In early 1942, Japan sank 3 American ships for every one they lost. By late 1942, America was sinking 2 Japanese ships for every loss. By 1943, the ratio reached 5-to-1. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, noticed the change. In his private correspondence later captured and translated, he wrote that the Americans seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Japanese operations. He suspected code breaking but couldn't prove it. His staff assured him that JN-25C was unbreakable. They were wrong, and their confidence cost them everything. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after Andrew Gleason first noticed the split alphabet pattern, American intelligence intercepted a message detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message included his complete itinerary: flight times, aircraft types, escort composition. The decoded intelligence went straight to Admiral Nimitz. Within hours, the decision was made. Operation Vengeance was authorized. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters flew over 400 miles to intercept Yamamoto's transport. They found him exactly where the intelligence said he would be. At 0934 hours on April 18, 1943, the man who planned Pearl Harbor was killed when his aircraft was shot down over Bougainville. The death of Yamamoto didn't end the war, but it devastated Japanese morale. Their greatest admiral, the symbol of naval invincibility, had been assassinated with surgical precision. The Americans had known exactly where he would be and exactly when. The psychological impact rippled through the Japanese military. If Yamamoto wasn't safe, nobody was safe. If the Americans could intercept the fleet commander's personal travel plans, what else could they read? The answer was almost everything. By mid-1943, Andrew Gleason's methods had been refined and systematized across the entire Pacific Intelligence Network. Over 1,000 cryptanalysts worked on JN-25 and its variants. Mechanical tabulators processed intercepts around the clock. The intelligence production rivaled the British operation at Bletchley Park. American commanders fought with their eyes open, while Japanese admirals stumbled blind. Submarine captains received daily briefings on convoy routes. Carrier task forces knew enemy fleet positions before their own scouts made contact. The advantages compounded month after month. Military historians would later estimate that signals intelligence shortened the Pacific War by 12 to 18 months. They calculated that at least 50,000 American lives were saved by the code-breaking operation. Some estimates ran much higher. And at the center of it all, still technically too young to vote, was a kid from Fresno who had lied about his age to join the Navy. Andrew Gleason received no medals. His name appeared in no newspapers. The code-breaking operation remained classified throughout the war and for decades afterward. He worked in obscurity surrounded by secrets he could never share. But the people who mattered knew what he had done. Admiral Nimitz knew. Commander Rochefort knew. Agnes Driscoll and Marshall Hall and Thomas Dyer knew. The men and women of OP-20G knew. In late 1943, Nimitz visited Station Hypo again. He found Andrew Gleason at his desk, surrounded by intercepts working on yet another Japanese code variant. The kid had turned 19 for real by then. He'd been doing this job for almost 2 years, Gleason Nimitz said. I've been reviewing the intelligence assessments. Do you know how many operations have been influenced by your work? No, sir. Neither do I. I stopped counting after 50. He paused. When this war ends, what do you want to do? Andrew thought about it. I want to study mathematics, sir. Real mathematics. The theoretical kind. Nimitz nodded. You've earned it. Whatever university you want, whatever program, I'll make sure you get in. That's a promise. It was a promise he would keep. But the war wasn't over yet. The Pacific Campaign had 18 more months to run. More codes to break. More secrets to uncover. More lives to save. Andrew Gleason went back to work. The story of the 17-year-old who cracked the Unbreakable code should end there. Victory achieved. Impact measured. Hero acknowledged. But there's one more chapter that most people don't know about. A chapter about what happened after the war ended. About what Andrew Gleason did with the rest of his life. About the secrets he kept for 50 years and the legacy he left behind. Because cracking JN-25 was just the beginning. The kid who noticed split alphabets would go on to solve problems that most mathematicians considered impossible. He would revolutionize entire fields of study. He would train generations of students who never knew about his classified war work. And in 1996, when the NSA finally declassified the JN-25 files, the world would learn for the first time what a 17-year-old file clerk had accomplished in a basement at Pearl Harbor. In Part 4, we'll discover what happened to Andrew Gleason after the war. We'll learn about his mathematical legacy, his 50 years of silence, and the moment when history finally recognized what he had done. Some stories end with victory. This one ends with something more. Let's trace the journey one more time. A 17-year-old kid from Fresno, California, forged his birth certificate to join the Navy one day after Pearl Harbor. He was assigned to sort files in a basement surrounded by Yale mathematicians and Naval Academy graduates who wouldn't give him the time of day. But while sorting thousands of intercepted messages, his pattern-obsessed brain noticed something everyone else had missed. The indicator headers in Japanese naval communications used split alphabets. That observation cracked the Unbreakable JN-25 code. It exposed the Japanese fleet at Midway. It enabled the destruction of 4 aircraft carriers and the death of Admiral Yamamoto. It transformed American intelligence from blind guessing to surgical precision. Military historians estimate that signals intelligence shortened the Pacific War by 18 months and saved at least 50,000 American lives. But what happened to Andrew Gleason after the war ended? What became of the kid who changed history from a basement in Pearl Harbor? This is where the story takes its strangest turn. Because Andrew Gleason didn't become famous. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews or accept medals on national television. Instead, he did something that seems almost impossible in our age of constant self-promotion. He disappeared. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Andrew Gleason faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. The newly formed National Security Agency wanted him desperately. They offered rank salary a career at the cutting edge of intelligence work. He had spent nearly 4 years breaking codes. He was one of the best cryptanalysts in the American military. The Cold War was beginning, and Soviet codes needed cracking. His skills were more valuable than ever. But Admiral Nimitz had made him a promise. Whatever university you want, whatever program, I'll make sure you get in. Andrew chose Yale. He enrolled in the fall of 1946 as a freshman, even though he had already done work that most PhD mathematicians would never match. He sat in introductory calculus classes alongside 18-year-olds who had spent the war years in high school. He never mentioned his service. He never talked about JN-25 or Midway or the basement at Pearl Harbor. The code breaking remained classified. Speaking about it was illegal. But even among the former cryptanalysts who knew what he had done, Andrew maintained an almost monastic silence. He seemed determined to leave that chapter of his life completely behind. His Yale professors noticed something unusual about the quiet young man in their classes. He solved problems differently than other students. Where most mathematicians approached challenges systematically building from established theorems, Andrew seemed to see solutions whole. He would stare at a problem for hours, sometimes days, and then suddenly announce the answer without being able to explain how he got there. It was the same gift that had spotted the split alphabet pattern, the same inability to not see structure in chaos. But now he was applying it to pure mathematics instead of enemy codes. He finished his Yale degree in 1949, completing a 4-year program in 3 years. Harvard's mathematics department recruited him immediately. By 1952, just 7 years after the war ended, Andrew Gleason solved Hilbert's fifth problem. To understand what that means, you need to know that David Hilbert was one of the greatest mathematicians in history. In 1900, he proposed 23 unsolved problems that he believed would shape mathematics for the 20th century. Solving any one of them was considered a career-defining achievement. Most remained unsolved for decades. Andrew Gleason cracked the fifth problem at age 30. The mathematical community was stunned. Here was a relatively unknown young professor who had seemingly appeared from nowhere and solved a challenge that had defeated the best minds in the field for over 50 years. But Andrew didn't stop there. In 1957, he published Gleason's theorem, a foundational result in quantum mechanics that is still taught in physics courses today. His work on Ramsey theory opened new fields of combinatorics. His contributions to coding theory, the mathematical study of information transmission, quietly revolutionized telecommunications. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had broken codes during the war spent his peacetime career building the mathematical foundations that made codes stronger. His theoretical work on error correction and data transmission helped create the secure communication systems we use today. But throughout all of this, Andrew Gleason never spoke publicly about his war service. His Harvard colleagues knew him as a brilliant but modest professor who preferred teaching undergraduates to chasing academic prestige. His students remembered a patient mentor who treated every question as worthy of serious consideration. None of them knew that the soft-spoken mathematician had once stood up in a room full of admirals and changed the course of history. The legacy Andrew Gleason left behind extends far beyond his personal achievements. The cryptanalysis methods he pioneered at Station Hypo became the foundation for American signals intelligence throughout the Cold War. The indicator analysis techniques, the statistical validation protocols, the systematic exploitation of operator errors. All of these approaches were refined and expanded by the NSA in the decades that followed. During the Korean War, American intelligence used evolved versions of Gleason's methods to intercept Chinese and North Korean communications. During Vietnam, the same principles helped track enemy movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The fundamental insight that codes are only as secure as the humans who use them proved valid across every conflict. But the influence spread beyond military applications. The mathematical techniques developed for code breaking found their way into civilian technology. Error correction codes that allow digital communications to function reliably. Encryption systems that protect financial transactions. Statistical methods that power modern data analysis. Every time you make a secure online purchase, every time your phone corrects a garbled signal, every time your computer recovers from a transmission error, you are benefiting from mathematics that traces its lineage back to that basement in Pearl Harbor. The numbers are staggering. Signals intelligence derived from JN-25 and its successors contributed to the destruction of over 800 Japanese ships during World War II. American submarines armed with decoded convoy routes sank 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping in 1943 alone. The strangulation of Japanese supply lines that followed helped end the war before a land invasion of Japan became necessary. Military historians estimate that such an invasion would have cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed approximately 200,000 people. If signals intelligence helped avoid a conventional invasion, the mathematics that Andrew Gleason pioneered may have saved more lives than any weapon in history. Today, the NSA employs over 40,000 people and operates the largest concentration of mathematical talent in the world. Every analyst in that organization learns techniques that evolved from the work done at Station Hypo. The lineage is direct and traceable. Andrew Gleason never sought recognition for any of this. He spent his career at Harvard teaching students solving problems, building mathematical foundations. When colleagues tried to nominate him for prestigious awards, he often asked them not to. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with fame. But his true legacy wasn't about recognition. It was about something far more important. The lesson of Andrew Gleason's story isn't really about cryptanalysis or mathematics or even World War II. It's about something much more fundamental. Innovation doesn't care about credentials. The greatest code breakers in America had spent 18 months failing to crack JN-25. They had degrees from Yale and Princeton. They had decades of experience. They had resources and equipment and institutional support, and they were stuck. The breakthrough came from a 17-year-old file clerk who wasn't supposed to be in the building. A kid who had lied about his age and had no formal training in cryptography. A teenager whose commanding officer told him to shut up and get back to sorting papers. Andrew Gleason succeeded because he didn't know what was supposed to be impossible. The experts had been staring at JN-25 so long that they couldn't see past their assumptions. They had decided that certain approaches were worthless and certain angles were not worth pursuing. The indicator headers were administrative noise. Nobody important was looking at them. But Andrew's mind didn't work that way. He couldn't not see patterns. He couldn't accept that something was noise just because everyone said so. He looked at the data with fresh eyes and found what the experts had been missing. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not engineers. Philo Farnsworth invented television at 14 years old. George Washington Carver was born into slavery and became one of America's greatest agricultural scientists. Marie Curie was told repeatedly that women couldn't do physics. The institutions that rejected these innovators weren't evil. They were just human. Organizations develop expertise, and that expertise creates blind spots. The more you know about how things are supposed to work, the harder it becomes to imagine them working differently. Andrew Gleason's story is a reminder that expertise is necessary but not sufficient. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from someone who doesn't know the rules well enough to follow them. Someone who asks stupid questions that turn out not to be stupid at all. In our current era of artificial intelligence and rapid technological change, this lesson matters more than ever. The next breakthrough might come from a graduate student, a garage tinkerer, a teenager with a laptop. It might come from someone that the experts have dismissed as unqualified. The question is whether our institutions are wise enough to listen. But there is one final detail about Andrew Gleason's story that almost nobody knows. A twist that only emerged decades after the war ended. In 1996, the National Security Agency began declassifying World War II cryptanalysis records. For the first time, researchers could access the original documents from Station Hypo. They could read the actual intercepts, the analysis logs, the internal memos that had been classified for over 50 years. Among those documents was a file labeled Personnel Assessment Station, Hypo 1942. It contained evaluation reports on every crypt analyst who had worked on JN-25. And buried in that file was a memo from Commander Joseph Rochefort, dated June 8, 1942, 4 days after the Battle of Midway. The memo was a recommendation for commendation. It listed the personnel most responsible for the intelligence breakthrough that enabled the victory. The names were familiar: Thomas Dyer, Wesley Wright, Joseph Finnegan, the senior crypt analysts who had worked around the clock to process Andrew's method. But at the bottom of the list was a handwritten addition. The ink was different, added after the memo was typed. It read simply, "And Seaman Andrew M. Gleason, age 17, who saw what the rest of us missed." The commendation was never processed. By the time it reached Washington, the Chicago Tribune leak had made everyone paranoid about acknowledging the code-breaking operation in any way. The memo was filed and forgotten. But Rochefort had known. Even in the chaos of the Pacific War, even with careers and reputations on the line, he had taken the time to write down the truth. A 17-year-old file clerk had cracked the code that won Midway. Andrew Gleason never saw that memo. He died on October 17, 2008 at age 86, without knowing that Rochefort had tried to give him credit. His obituaries focused on his mathematical achievements: Hilbert's fifth problem, Gleason's theorem, his decades of service to Harvard. Most didn't mention the war. Most didn't know there was anything to mention. But now the archives are open. The documents are public. The story can finally be told. In the Cryptologic Museum at NSA headquarters, there's a small display about JN-25. It includes photographs of Agnes Driscoll and Joseph Rochefort and the other legends of American code breaking. And in one corner, there's a picture of a baby-faced kid in an ill-fitting Navy uniform. The caption reads, "Seaman Andrew M. Gleason, OP-20G, 1942. His indicator subtraction method helped break JN-25 and win the Battle of Midway." It doesn't mention that he was 17. It doesn't mention the forged birth certificate or the years of silence or the mathematical career that followed. It's just a photograph and a single sentence. But for those who know the full story, that's enough. So, what do we take from all of this? What does the story of Andrew Gleason mean for us today? From a 17-year-old file clerk with a forged birth certificate to a breakthrough that changed the course of World War II. From a kid who wasn't supposed to be in the building to intelligence that saved an estimated 50,000 American lives and shortened the Pacific War by 18 months. From a teenager that nobody would listen to a mathematician who quietly revolutionized multiple fields of study. Andrew Gleason proved something that institutions often forget. The best ideas don't always come from the people with the best credentials. Sometimes they come from the people who are too young or too inexperienced or too naive to know what's supposed to be impossible. The code wasn't really unbreakable. It just needed someone who didn't know it was supposed to be. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovator who changed history from the shadows, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. And if you want to discover more hidden chapters of World War II, subscribe to this channel. We upload new documentaries every week about the people and moments that shaped our world. Because history isn't just about generals and presidents. It's about file clerks and mechanics and farmers and teenagers. It's about ordinary people who refused to accept that extraordinary things were impossible. Andrew Gleason spent 50 years keeping secrets. He never sought fame or credit or recognition. He just did his job first in a basement at Pearl Harbor, then in classrooms at Harvard. He saved lives and changed history, and never said a word about it. In his rare 1998 interview about the war, long after the declassification made it legal to speak, Gleason said something that captures everything. "I was young and stupid and lucky. The real heroes were the people who gave me a chance to be heard." But here's the thing about luck. It only matters if you're paying attention. Andrew Gleason was lucky that Admiral Nimitz walked into that briefing room. He was lucky that Rochefort and Dyer were willing to listen. But none of that luck would have mattered if he hadn't been looking at those indicator headers night after night, filling notebooks he wasn't supposed to have, refusing to accept that the patterns he saw were meaningless. The luck found him because he was ready for it. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not just that innovation can come from anywhere, but that readiness is its own kind of genius. Andrew Gleason spent 10 weeks sorting messages before his breakthrough. 10 weeks of boring, thankless work that nobody cared about. But he was paying attention the whole time. He was looking for patterns even when nobody asked him to. When the moment came when Admiral Nimitz asked if anyone had answers, Andrew Gleason was ready. The question is whether we would be ready. Whether we're paying attention to the patterns around us. Whether we're filling our own notebooks with observations that nobody else cares about. Because somewhere out there right now, there's a problem that everyone says is unsolvable. There's a code that experts have declared unbreakable. There's a challenge that the credentialed and experienced have given up on. And somewhere out there, there's a kid who doesn't know it's supposed to be impossible. That's the legacy of Andrew Gleason. Not the theorems or the awards or the mathematical foundations. The legacy is the proof that sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody expected. The one who shouldn't even be in the room.